Welcome to the Mount Hamilton Baptist Church podcast. We're glad you're here. We're a church of connected, Christian, and missional people here in Hamilton, Ontario. We meet every Sunday morning at 10:30-ish, and we'd love to have you come join us in person. Come as you are, and all are welcome. For more information about Sunday morning worship, our other ministries, or how to get connected in community, please visit our website at mhbc.ca. Now here's the sermon. Good morning, everybody. Do you know the biggest genre in the library of books that we call the Bible? Now, some might say it's the law or wisdom or epistles, things that tell us how to follow God and his calling in our lives. Some would probably say it's poetry. We serve a creative God whom we learn about through creative writings and literature. But the biggest genre in the Bible, in fact, almost half of it, is actually narrative. It's learning about God and his calling for our lives through stories. Some of these are fictional or parables, some are historical accounts. Some give us lessons on what to do, and others serve as object lessons on what doesn't work. Yet woven throughout the pages of the Bible is God's story, where he is the main character, inviting us to participate. See, I don't think it's a coincidence that Jesus told a lot of stories. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Bible is full of a lot of stories, because stories tug at our hearts. They make something relatable. They give meaning to things, and they allow us to connect. It's why I'm so excited for this series, all about our favorite stories that we as a church family have connected with. Now, there was only one story that came in multiple times. The road to Emmaus, about Jesus walking with two disciples after his resurrection. If you include it being one of my own favorite stories, then we're actually at 3 people submitting it. And I think we're in good company because throughout history, this has been known as an important story. N.T. Wright says in his commentary, if the story of the prodigal son has a claim to be the finest story Jesus ever told, then the tale of the two on the road to Emmaus must have an equal claim to be the finest scene Luke ever sketched. It is both a wonderful, unique, spellbinding tale and also a model for a great deal of what being a Christian from that day to this is all about. Edward Schillebeck, a Belgian theologian, he was once asked, if you had to pick one story or text from the Bible to name a cultural moment in the late modern West, without hesitation, he said Luke 24, the road to Emmaus, because it captures what our current world is like. What is fascinating about the 3 of us here in Mount Hamilton picking this story is that we actually had 3 different reasons as to why this is our favorite story. While the other 2 asked to be anonymous, they did give me permission to share why they picked this story. And while different, each of our reasons for connecting with this story has something to teach us. Number 1, life without hope. The person who suggested this wrote in and said, the road to Emmaus is my favorite story as it captures what it's like when you lose hope in Jesus. These 2 disciples were walking away from everything, and they were saddened and without hope. It reminds me that in my walk with Jesus, I need to remember that he brings hope. Luke starts this story about the 2 of them. In context, these are disciples of Jesus. Notice that it's anonymous. From the author, Luke, this is on purpose. One of them is later named Cleopas, but scholars suspect this is actually a husband and wife pairing. Cleopas and his wife Mary is mentioned in John's Gospel. Luke starts this story with no names, though, given. And that's on purpose, because it's any man, any woman, any disciple of Jesus. We are meant to read ourselves into this story. So they're walking and talking about all the things that have happened over the weekend, from the triumphal entry into Jerusalem to then the arrest and the trial and public execution of Jesus, their master. So Jesus, incognito mode, kind of sneaks up behind them and asks, hey, what are you talking about? And the response is Luke's humor. It's drenched in irony. Don't you know what has happened? They're saying, but they're talking to the only person who actually knows what's happened. Jesus, of course, plays along and asks them, oh, what are you talking about? And then you get a key line here. They say, we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. We had hoped. Then they tell them that some people believe Jesus is risen, but it's very clear from their telling that they are not part of that group that believes. This is also matched by the fact that they're leaving Jerusalem, going away from the action and where Jesus might be, which is not something you do if you believe that he's risen, right? These two disciples have lost hope. It's why that the Belgian theologian Edward Schillebeeckx that I read earlier picked this as the story to capture what it's like in our world here in the West. We have lost hope. The results when you lose hope is melancholy, confusion, and a loss of purpose. These disciples are downcast. They have forgotten what they know and what Jesus taught them. And they're wandering away from everything and what is happening in Jerusalem, away from where they need to be. We had hoped, they said. And we say that too. We had hoped our loved one wouldn't go through this sickness and pain that they currently are. We had hoped that that person wouldn't have died. Couldn't their story have just been a little bit longer and we had more time with them? We had hoped that the church or Christians wouldn't be known for scandals and abuse and things that have nothing to do with Jesus. We had hope, things like the tragedy in Texas, that these things wouldn't happen. We had hoped, and feel free to fill in with whatever you might, because we've all felt this at some point in our lives. The second person who suggested that we look at this story kind of gives us the answer. The importance of the resurrection. They wrote, "This is one of my favorite stories as it shows the importance of the resurrection. The news of Jesus being risen changes everything." See, Cleopas' puzzled statement, all the pain, all the confusion, the loss of purpose that these two disciples are sharing in, it only needs the slightest twist to turn it into a joyful statement of the early Christian faith. It goes from they crucified him, but we had hoped he would redeem Israel, to quickly becoming they crucified him, and that was how he did redeem Israel. The resurrection was what makes the difference. The most certain thing in life that you and I can be aware of is that we all one day will die. Of the billions and billions of people who have lived on earth throughout all of its time, there is only one person who that statement is not true of: Jesus. A man who lived thousands of years ago, who never wrote any book or wrote anything down, who was never a leader in a sense of owning this position of power or authority by earthly standards, who only had a public ministry of 3 years before he was publicly executed, would have been lost to the sands of time if it were not for the resurrection. There were lots of would-be messiahs that rose up around this time, but we don't know many of them because Jesus is the difference. Resurrection is the difference. Without the resurrection, we would all have done what the disciples are currently doing, walking away. Yet after the resurrection, hundreds of disciples saw Jesus resurrected, and all were willing to die for that fact instead of recanting. For the next 300 years, until Christianity became legal, Jesus' disciples were killed and persecuted. Our hope, even in the face of death and evil, is found in the resurrection, that death and sin were actually defeated. All right, the third person, being myself, why this is my favorite story, is that Jesus walked with them. My reason for being one of my favorite stories is that this is my story. I am one of these disciples. I grew up in the Christian world, was always going to church. There was always a Westra on the board of deacons at my church. I had read through the Bible multiple times, and I had scripture memorized. I could tell you all the right answers and say all the right things. I was always the designated driver for my friends, as I didn't drink or party. I did the right things. I was involved in ministry in my youth group. I ran an outreach ministry at my school. I was all in on Jesus. In high school, I had a friend who was passionate about Jesus as well, who passed away suddenly from a drunk driving accident. And that loss threw me and my entire life into a spiral. Does God actually care about any of this if he lets that happen? I pulled away from the church. And you know what? None of my friends seemed to really care, which led me to believe that the church is just full of hypocrites and people who are more consumed with their own lives than anybody else. I had lost hope. My life was marked with melancholy, confusion, and it had no purpose. I stopped going to church completely, and I walked away from who I was as a Christian. It's not the end of the story, though. In my final year of high school, we had an intern youth pastor named Adam stay at our house. I don't know if this was my parents' plan or just God working. Adam and I became close friends. We played and we watched basketball together. He was one of the top college prospects in the country. We would also watch weird sports sometimes when basketball wasn't on, late at night. Professional tag or chess, boxing, or dodgeball tournaments. Yes, those all exist. We shared a love for pizza, and over this year, we ate a lifetime worth of pizza. Thankfully, we were both young and athletes, so our metabolism was working for us. There was lots of TV, basketball, pizza, and video games together in our friendship. Through all of that, Adam didn't force the conversation about faith. He didn't tell me where I was wrong and stupid and I needed to change my ways. There wasn't a Bible study that he thought would answer my questions or heal my hurt. Not that those are bad things, but he was just with me. It wasn't with any agenda. I wasn't a ministry project. I was his friend. He loved me like Christ loves others. And he was with me. It was friendship. And after months of building trust, I remember it was 2 a.m. and we were playing Halo and eating pizza, our second pizza of the day, actually. And I asked him, why do you still believe in Jesus when these things happen? And you know what? He didn't really have an answer, but he shared what worked for him. And that started the long journey of coming back to faith for me. Adam saw a hurting kid who needed Jesus, and he didn't just say he was for me, he was actually with me. Present, investing, and loving me where I was so that I could one day hear what I needed to hear and start healing. It wasn't about knowing the right things or having the right answers. It wasn't the right program or the perfect ministry. It was somebody being present and walking with me on my journey. I would not be here if it were not for Adam. And I don't mean as a pastor wanting to help people draw close to Jesus. I mean, I wouldn't be alive. I had lost hope. My life was marked with depression, confusion, and I felt aimless and no purpose. And when your life is filled with those things, you continue to spiral more and more down until you get some help. And that help came in Adam being the hand of Jesus and reaching out to me, walking with me, and loving me. This is what I love about this story so much. Jesus walks with the disciples. He plays dumb like he doesn't know what's going on. And the irony is the fact that he's the only one that knows what's going on. He listens to them. He journeys with them the entire way on the road, going in the wrong direction. Think about it, right? He could have shown up at the beginning of the journey and he had just said, here I am, it's me, Jesus, now believe. Hey, we're just outside of Jerusalem, let's turn around and go tell the others. But Jesus doesn't do that, does he? Jesus walks with them the entire way in the wrong direction away from Jerusalem and where they needed to be. Why? I think it's because it's what they needed at the time. They were not ready to hear Jesus. When they're talking about this, Jesus actually gives arguably the harshest message to the disciples in any of the Gospels. How foolish are you and how slow to believe all the prophets have spoken? Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter into his glory? I'm not sure the tone that Jesus has here. I assume it's very much said in love because it's Jesus, but you can almost feel the disappointment in Jesus' words, can't you? Again, it's not anger. He doesn't shame them. He doesn't say, you guys are lousy disciples, you're out. How dare you? I was wrong about you. You could not have followed me. But it's also not the end of what he has to say to them. Instead, he continues to walk with them and speak truth into their lives. He explains from the beginning of their understanding all about the Messiah and how God's story has pointed to Jesus all along. If I could eavesdrop on any conversation in history, this might be it. But it's not until they are at the table breaking bread, rich in symbolic language and reminiscent of a few days earlier in the Last Supper, it's then where their eyes were opened and they knew who he was. Then, in classic Jesus, he disappears, poof, in front of their eyes. I really wish I was good at magic and I could do this like as an illustration on stage or something and just disappear for dramatic effect and then reappear on the balcony or something. You'd always remember that sermon, right? We don't know why the disciples couldn't recognize Jesus. We don't know. It just says they were kept from recognizing him. We don't know if this is a supernatural veiling. Jesus' resurrected body was transformed in some sense, but yet recognizable in other circumstances and stories that we get. It also could be related, I think, actually to their lack of faith. They failed to recognize the events of what just happened as part of God's redemption story, because the point of this story is that they were blind to who Jesus was, both in the events in Jerusalem and now here on the road. They didn't recognize him, or they were kept from recognizing him because they didn't believe and weren't looking for him. Perhaps Luke is saying we can only know Jesus, can only recognize him in any sense when we learn to see him within the true story of God and the redemption of the world. When we keep who Jesus is, why he came, and who he is, we start to see him and where he is active in our lives. I'm excited to keep diving into stories this summer. At the end of this series, we're going to have a Sunday service of sharing our own stories and how they're connected to God's story that we're exploring. Here is the invitation, my friends, my church family. As we go through these stories, where do you find that your story relates? When we read yourself into these stories and realize that God has been walking with you, where do you see that in your own life? You don't have to share up front at the service. If you feel that's actually on your heart to share up front, we'd love to have you. Please come talk to myself or Leslie. But if you feel a connection to one of these stories, if you're saying, actually, that's part of my story, or this is my story as I feel about this one today that I'm sharing, then I encourage you, the challenge to you is to share with somebody in our community that you trust. A friend, a family member, even anybody on the board would love to hear your stories. I want us to become a community that is about sharing stories with each other. Not just about God's story, but our own stories and where our stories actually intersect with God's stories. Because stories tug at our hearts. They make something relatable and they give meaning to things because they allow us to connect. Let's be a community that shares our stories as it connects with God's story. And I think we'll see over and over and over again this repeated theme that Jesus has been walking with each of us throughout our lives the entire time, meeting us where we need to be. Thanks for joining us today. If you have any questions or thoughts on this teaching, we'd love to hear from you and connect. For more information about our church and all the things happening at MHBC, you can visit our website at mhbc.ca.